So, Joel, with the end of the flood, we're pretty much at the end of one phase of history, very typical in the ancient Near East in general, that the flood is the great divider. And really what the new phase starts up here at the end of Genesis 11 when Abraham comes on scene. And as the story is told here, he starts out in Ur of the Chaldees. And that way of referring to it, most people I think would say must be fairly late. But in any case, they're insistent that he starts out in Mesopotamia and comes through Haran in Syria. And I think maybe this is something to keep in mind. We'll be coming back to it. And what are these stories claiming about where these patriarchs came from in the first case? But more important for us in the case of Abraham here is where he's headed.
Yeah.
And in Genesis 12, now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go forth from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So what exactly is, this is sometimes maybe not quite justifiably called the covenant with Abraham. It's much more of a covenant in chapter 15, which we'll get to. Here,
and
it's
17,
it's a
but
call, yes, indeed, and here it's a call and a promise.
Yeah.
What's
It's for such a famous and important segment, it's not exactly clear what is supposed to be happening here. What does it mean, really, for God to say, "I will bless you"? What does that blessing consist of? What does it mean for Abraham to be a blessing? How does one be a blessing? What does it mean at the end that all the nations of the earth will be blessed in you, by you, through you? And actually the question of what that means is an interesting
it doesn't mean that everybody's going to like you, because there are some people
I think that's safe to say.
That some people will curse you.
Right.
So.
Yeah, no, it's, the real question is, what is God promising Abraham to do here? And I think the key phrase here is, "I will make you a great nation." Throughout the stories of the patriarchs, this divine promise comes up again and again, multiple times, really, to each patriarch. It's in every one of the sources. It's in J, it's in E, it's in P, in different degrees with slightly different wording. What they all have in common is the notion that God is going to make the patriarchs into a great nation. And that has really two parts. Right? In the ancient world, even today, there are two elements that are needed to be a great nation. One is you need enough people to constitute a nation.
Yeah, or at least you need people.
At least you need people. And you need
That's going to be an issue.
A place those people live. Right? There's no nation in the ancient world, right? Because the word here in Hebrew is a goy, right? A nation, which is goy is the sort of state word, right? As opposed to which is the word for sort of an ethnic group, right? A goy is a political unit, right? You will be a great nation in our modern sense, as opposed to a great people.
Yeah. But there is a little bit of irony in the long run in the fact that Abraham has promised that he'll be a goy. But, in the Jewish tradition, these are the Gentiles.
This is true. This is true.
So
but at the same time, right, what's happening here in the greater story is Abraham, the world is full of nations that have established themselves. At the end of the primeval history, this is what happens. Right? The world is populated by the nations. Right? There's what's called the table of nations. Yeah. Abraham is an individual who comes out of one of those established nations and is told, "I'm going to make a new one, not one of the ones that was established of old, but you are going to become a new nation among all the others, carved out of them." And the way that happens is through this blessing. Right? God will bless Abraham with progeny and with land. And when you read all of these promises to the patriarchs, they're all progeny and land, right? "I will make you as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands and the sea, and I will give this land to you and your descendants."
And a lot of the drama in Genesis is going to be the threats to the fulfillment of one or other of these promises.
Sure. I mean, frankly, I think this is the story of the Pentateuch as a whole. Right? Because the promise itself is not going to be fulfilled even by the end of the Pentateuch. They have not actually taken the land yet. But if you think about it, right, Genesis is the story of will they actually survive to procreate, right?
Yeah.
The barren matriarchs, the threats to their well-being as they travel through the land.
Now, the next major presentation of the promise to Abraham in Genesis 15 starts out specifically with that issue. Or at least nearly starts out with it. Abram said, "O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless."
Yeah.
Saying, in effect, all this talk about being a great nation is great, but if I don't have a son, how is this going to happen?
And we learned back in Genesis 11 that Sarah was infertile, even before the promise was made.
Yeah. And he says, "The heir to my house is Eliezer of Damascus." And the Lord says to him, "Look toward heaven and count the stars, if you're able to count them, and so shall your descendants be." And now again in the NRSV translation, "He believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness." Now, this would be a foundation of a whole strand of Christian theology later on.
Would you care to extrapolate on the Christian readings of Genesis 15:6 and maybe talk about whether or not they are maybe true to what the author there intended?
Well, you know, we have problems at both ends of that. On the one hand, what does it mean in Genesis, which is what concerns us most here? And there's also a big question what it means for Paul in the New Testament. As I understand it here, Abraham is being told that he's going to be a great nation when he doesn't even have a child. Therefore, it's an implausible thing to believe. And the fact that he does believe it is reckoned to him as righteousness. Now, mind you, he isn't told, and that's absolutely all, the only thing I'll ever ask of you. He's not being told, that's all you have to do.
And we know,
Now,
in fact, more will be asked.
More will be asked. But in the New Testament, what Paul does with this, that is not at all in Genesis, is set it up in contrast to the works of the law. Now, of course, you don't have a law, strictly speaking, in Genesis anyway. So this is quite an extrapolation. What you will have in Genesis, in one source or the other, is an insistence that Abraham is blameless in some way, but there is the implication that there is some code of conduct to which he is being held. Now, of course, actually, if you read St. Paul, you find he's holding people to some code of conduct too. So it may be that Paul wasn't as simplistic as some of his followers made him out to be. But at the same time, it's the contrast, I think, that is really different between the two. Right. But nonetheless, also, you know, that orientation of trust is rather fundamental, I think, in this telling of the promise here.
Yeah, there is throughout the patriarchs, there is a consistent emphasis on fearing God, right? Fearing in the sense of obeying and believing and trusting. And I think that's certainly coming out here also.
Yeah, that I suppose would be especially characteristic of the Elohist source, but you know, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, pretty well across the board. Yes. One other thing here on Genesis 15. At the end of it, after he goes through this strange ritual, which we won't get into, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. So now, or with Abram, as he's still called here. So it's a little bit more formal here. And the promise is here, to your descendants I give this land. From the river of Egypt, the great river, to the river Euphrates. Wow, that's a lot of territory.
Are you telling me that's not the current borders of Israel?
Israel.
I guess it's not.
Well, you know, it wasn't the current borders even of Solomon's empire either, I guess. And so I suppose in both cases it's aspirational rather than factual.
I would certainly say it is.
And maybe just as well if it doesn't quite get realized.
Yeah, it's interesting though that they had any conception of an ancestral right to that sort of territory when they never held it at all.
I know, yeah. We need to say something about the priestly version of this covenant in chapter 17.
That's right. We've seen J in Genesis 12 with the call of Abraham. We see the covenant in Genesis 15 that I think is from E. Genesis 17 is the priestly covenant, and here most famous for the introduction of the notion of circumcision.
No, we had in Genesis 15, if we had had time to talk more about it, we had the notion of cutting a covenant.
Right. Different kind here.
Different kind of, yes.
This is an interesting text in which, again, Abraham says, how is any of this possible? And God says, well, there's Ishmael, but Ishmael is not going to be the recipient of the promise, though he is blessed. Right? Ishmael says, I'll make of him a great nation.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be Ishmael, it's going to be Isaac. Isaac is going to be the one to carry on the line of blessing. And the covenant that's made here is this covenant of circumcision. And Abraham is supposed to circumcise absolutely everyone in his household, himself included, his to-be-born son Isaac included, Ishmael included. And this is going to mark Abraham apart from everyone else.
Now, of course, the Israelites were not the only people in the ancient world who were circumcised.
That's right.
Lots of people were circumcised. Why did circumcision get to be such a big deal?
Well, there are different theories about this. It's often taken as sort of a way of distinguishing Israelites in particular from their Mesopotamian counterparts. That is, circumcision became an important aspect of Israelite identity when they were defining themselves against Mesopotamia in the exile, perhaps. Yeah. But for the most part, my sense is they were looking for simply defining features of their community.
Other people who were closer to them earlier on, the Mesopotamians,
like the Canaanites
and the Philistines.
And the Philistines, yeah.
Especially now if we get to talk at some point about Samuel, there's a great story about collecting the foreskins of Philistines. Mm-hmm. And the Philistines are referred to as the uncircumcised.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, how useful this would be to help you recognize one if you met them on the street.
Right, and so, I mean, you raise the question of who circumcision is for, right? Is circumcision a way for an Israelite to meet another Israelite and know them? I don't think so. I think that would have been taken care of already by Adam and Eve with their fig leaves. Really, circumcision, I think quite clearly in Genesis 17, is a reminder for God. Right? It's actually the same words are used about this that are used for the rainbow in the flood story. That is, what is circumcision supposed to remind God of? Well, I think it's the be fruitful and multiply, which he says here in Genesis 17 to Abraham. That is, when God sees the Israelites engaging in familiar relations,
increasing and multiplying,
and multiplying, he is supposed to remember, I have to make that union fruitful. That's what I think the purpose of circumcision is. So it's less that Abraham needs to, it's not less a quid pro quo and more, I need you to do this so that I can identify you from all the other peoples. It's like marking the doorpost with blood in Exodus, right? I need to be able to tell you apart because I've promised to do something for you.
And it's good to know that God also needs reminders. Mm-hmm. He's not the only one who needs to have notes. I mean, we're not the only ones who need to have notes.
Oh, regularly. That's right.